Hello, everyone. On behalf of 𝘃𝙧𝙖𝙯𝙚 Editions and the King's Co-op Bookstore, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this exploration of climate change in fiction. So we will be joined by our authors, Catherine Bush and Patricia Robertson, and their featured titles. I have them right here: Blaze Island and Hour of the Crab. My name is Megan. I'm going to be your host for this evening. I would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the unsurrendered and unceded traditional land of the 𝘾𝙧𝙖𝙯𝙚 and Mi'kmaq, recognized in a series of peace and friendship treaties that established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. So as we are gathered virtually, if anyone is interested, feel free to put your own treaty and land acknowledgements in the chat. I know we're probably gathered from all different lands at the moment. And I would also like to give an extra special thank you to the Writers Union of Canada and the Canadian Council for the Arts. Without their support, this event would not be possible. So an extra special thank you to them. So for anyone who does not have a copy of the books that we're going to be discussing this evening, they are going to be available locally for those of you tuning in from Halifax at King's Co-op Bookstore. You can find them online at kingsbookstore.ca. They are taking online orders and are offering free delivery in the Halifax Regional Municipality, and also delivery by bicycle on the peninsula, which is pretty neat. And they are also offering nationwide shipping for anyone tuning in from afar. So tonight, we're going to be starting off with readings by both of our authors from their books. And then I'm going to step back so that we can all enjoy a climate-themed conversation between Catherine and Patricia. At the end, I'll pop back in so that we can finish off our time by answering any of your questions. So as the event goes on, feel free to, at any time, type any questions that come to you in the live chat. I will be watching it, so your questions will not get lost. And you can type them in whenever. It's not going to disrupt any of our conversation. So whenever they come to you, type them away. And then without further ado, I'm going to introduce Catherine Bush before she reads to us from her novel, Blaze Island. So Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels, including Blaze Island, which is a Globe and Mail Best Book. Her book, Accusations, was longlisted for Canada Reads, and 𝘾𝙧𝙖𝙯𝙀 was shortlisted for the Trillium Award. She was recently a Fiction Meets Science Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Germany and has spoken internationally about addressing the climate crisis in fiction. She's coordinator of the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA and can be found online at catherinebush.com. And a little bit about the book. It's been called Riveting and Morally Complex, as well as a beautiful, far-seeing, and fiercely intelligent novel about the most critical question of our time. In Blaze Island, a Category 5 hurricane sweeps up the eastern seaboard of North America, leaving devastation in its wake, its outer wings brushing over tiny Blaze Island. During this wild night, a stranger washes up on the doorsteps of the isolated house where Milan Wells, a climate scientist whose career was destroyed by climate change deniers, lives with his daughter, Miranda. In the aftermath of the storm, Miranda finds herself in a world altered so quickly that she hardly knows what has happened or what the unpredictable future will bring. And with that, I am going to pass us all over into the capable hands of Catherine. So over to you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Megan, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, 𝘃𝙧𝙖𝙯𝙯 for hosting this evening. Thanks to the Writers Union and Canada Council and King's Co-op Bookshop. I'm coming to you from Toronto, territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, which binds them and all who come after them to share and protect the land. So yeah, Megan has given a lovely introduction to the novel itself. So Milan Wells and his daughter Miranda are living in isolation on this island as the world's climate grows weirder. Milan Wells begins to wonder if some kind of tech intervention will be necessary to save the planet and protect his daughter and those who come after her. But it's with the arrival of an alluring stranger in the midst of this huge storm that Miranda's world is overturned, and she's thrown into this moment of everything change in which she has to re-examine the past, reconstitute her present, reimagine her future. So I often read from the beginning, but I'm actually going to read from an episode further into the book between Miranda and her, the young man she grows up with, an islander named 𝘾𝙧𝙖𝙗, who also works for her father. And they are, quite intimate through their growing up, and he kind of introduces her and shows her the island and familiarizes her with the land in very particular ways. But this is a moment that will end up sundering their relationship. So I'm going to read that and then move quickly to a passage in the present. I hope this will set up our conversation. It was a long way around the island to where the icebergs were, past Sheep's Cove and Auk Point and Tom's Neck, past the wide mouth of Shallow Bay, past Herring Cove, the green mound of Bear Head, then the hilly harbor of the town of Blaze. It was hard to talk while in the boat, Caleb at the tiller in the stern, Miranda on the bench in front of him, riding the swells like the wild creatures they were, their speed creating its own wind, the constant thwack of wave against boat a percussive register of their passage. Not speaking hardly mattered. She was happy to drink in the air and be splendidly free from all that usually surrounded her. Far at their backs, icebergs floated slowly past out on the Labrador Current, shimmering in a heat haze at the horizon. When they came at last around that volcanic mound of Blaze Head, rising like a giant skull out of the water, there were the masses of icebergs that Caleb had promised and that Miranda's father had mentioned at supper the evening before. Icebergs filling the entire breadth of the bay, stretching northward as far as the eye could see, so many it was impossible to count. Large ones, tall as houses, small ones like pale creatures. The blue of the sky had turned dull white under a haze of cirrus cloud, and still the icebergs glistened, every color in the spectrum of blue and green, cobalt, turquoise, aquamarine, emerald. From one angle, they looked like one thing, from another, something else. As the icebergs turned, they revealed arches, hollows, ponds, fissures. It was hard to know how to describe them other than to compare them to other things. This one's a castle. No, a dragon. There were no words. Some swayed, unbalanced by their melting. Drafts of cold air billowed from them. For long moments, the two of them sat in the boat, motor idling, and, awed into silence, they did no more than stare. The icebergs were as old as the ice her father had once studied. Could some of them actually be the same ice? Layers of thousands of years, their own lives nothing but a film on top. Yet the icebergs had come here to dissolve. How little time it took for eternities to vanish. Gone. The thought sank into Miranda. Could you say an iceberg was dying? They'd come here to die? Her father might say so. Here they were, witnessing that death. The death of the world. Their world. Them? This was what her father feared. The death of the world as they knew it. The icebergs floated mutely in the heat. Their presence seemed to speak and pose a question. Miranda asked Caleb to go closer, could they? Mindful of the depths that lay beneath the iceberg surfaces, the risk that one might tip and founder, he motored slowly in among the nearer ones. Her body quailed and yearned. For what? Something turned over deep inside her. The air was colder now. The icebergs creaked. Some distance off, a crack sounded, harsh as a bullet, and a chunk broke from a great crag and with a crash tumbled into froth, its fall pushing the whole mass sideways, a wave surging in their direction. Swiftly, Caleb turned the boat and drove them away from the icebergs, southward into the open water of the bay. Miranda swung a glance over her shoulder. Shouldn't they be going the other way, back, which meant northward around the island and so home? When she shouted at Caleb, asking him where he was headed, he seemed not to hear. Nor did he stop, but kept motoring into the bay, the bow now fixed on the distant green shore. Tensing, Miranda shouted again, and this time Caleb cut back the motor. With a bright smile, he said, "I thought we'd take a little trip, an adventure, Miranda. It's truly the day for it, just the two of us, a trip across the bay." "Across the bay?" "My cousin Jer's on the 3 o'clock. He'll pick us up on Bayside and take us into town. Or we'll call a cab. We'll go out for a meal, whatever you wish, Miranda." "What if my father finds out? If someone sees us and tells him?" "We'll ask them not to. Everyone already thinks it's strange that you never leave. You can't for any reason. Why shouldn't you, Miranda? One afternoon, you're 18. Where's the harm in it? It'll be some fun, I promise." In her first years at the island school, girls, Brianna Morton, Caitlin Harvey, others, sometimes asked her to come along when their mothers agreed to drive them into the Gander malls. But when Miranda always said no, they stopped asking. She became known as the girl who didn't leave, couldn't, wouldn't, the only one. When people asked why, she said she and her father didn't. Always Caleb had accepted this aspect of her life without ridicule or protest. Would she be like this forever? Maybe. The bond she shared with her father was strong, though yes, she had sometimes asked Caleb to describe Gander to her, the airport, or St. John's with its brightly painted houses and steep streets. Phoneless, she had sometimes looked at the world through his phone and texted her father on it, or together, she and Caleb had watched a movie on its tiny screen. She had never flouted her father's rules, understanding the reasons he gave for them, that they had all they needed on the island. More people needed to live as close to home as they did. Danger had driven them to Blaze Island. As far as Miranda could tell, from overhearing her father's conversations, from her own brief forays online, the outer world hadn't altered. The deniers were still there, even growing stronger, heat intensifying, storms worsening, most people going on as before, while the blanket of gases accumulated above them all. To leave the island was to take a step back towards all that. "I can't go over there," Miranda said. The sun had broken through its haze, and warmth poured down on them. Off in the distance beyond Caleb, the silent chorus of icebergs floated over the water. Above their heads, terns squeaked and tore through the air. "If your father finds out, tell him you wanted to go." "I can't, Caleb. Please don't make me." Every particle in Miranda's body stiffened at the thought, and if it made her seem foolish, she didn't care. Yes, her father would be angry. Yes, he had a temper, but it was more than that. She wanted to be back on the island, feet on that ground, feel every particular of that place around her, its tremulous shelter, a small thing to set against the deepest fears. The scene continues, but I'm going to skip ahead and just read a little passage from the present of the novel as Miranda contemplates the everything change of the present. Always, when she'd allowed herself to think about the future, it had been shaped by the contours of the past. How else did you envision what was to come, other than by reconfiguring what you knew? There were days when, swayed by Caleb's suggestions, she had imagined living with him on the far side of the cove, even as another part of her retracted from the dream. She had assumed that somehow Caleb and Sylvia would be in her life forever. What she loved would always continue. How could it not? More often, she'd seen herself living in the little white house in Green Cove with her father and Ella, taking care of her father because he needed her to do this. She'd ruffle Ella's fur, meet her brown-eyed stare. There'd be more animals because she wanted more. She would tend the land, build a bigger greenhouse, listen and note each time the wind shifted. There would be order and safety in such a life, in its deep choreographies and self-sufficiencies, in being responsive to sea and sky and the wild and ragged weather growing wilder all around them. There had been ruptures and alterations, but nothing had shaken her fundamental belief in the continuity of this life, given to her after the biggest rupture of all, the catastrophes that had sent the two of them fleeing to the island. Everything here was proof that, despite grief, a new life could be made. Even the rupture of losing Caleb, painful as it was, had somehow been bearable. She'd gone on. They all had. Now, though, the world looked so different, she wasn't sure she could step back into the body she'd inhabited only a day ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that there is something very magical about getting to hear an author read from their book, and I probably could have listened to you read your entire book. But now I am going to welcome our next reader, Patricia Robertson. So fresh off of her book's launch last week, Patricia will be reading from Hour of the Crab. Patricia grew up in British Columbia and received her MA in creative writing from Boston University. She's the author of 3 books of stories, including City of Orphans, a finalist for the Ethel Wilson Prize. So her new collection of short fiction, Hour of the Crab, has been called Fascinating and Dark, playing with the edge of what is real and what could be, as well as exhilarating and poised, a mythos of modern times. So in Hour of the Crab, readers travel with Robertson's vivid characters, sharing their journeys, their challenges, their complicated choices. They discover other worlds, from an 11th century monastery in France to a near future British Columbia where apocalyptic wildfires seem to be never ending. And I can't think of a better place to end that and pass it over to you, Patricia. So moving on, Patricia, you can start your reading.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Megan. That was actually a very appropriate segue because, in fact, it's the story about the apocalyptic wildfires that I will read from this evening. But before I do that, I wanted also to thank the Canada Council and the National Public Readings Program of the Writers' Union of Canada, who are supporting both Catherine and I tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 1 territory, and that the land that we are gathered on is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, 𝘾𝙘𝙪, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before I read from the story, I'll just give you a little bit of background, enough, I think, so you can enter it while listening to it. The main character is a wildland firefighter called 𝘾𝙧𝙖, who's in his late 30s, and the story is set in British Columbia in the coastal mountains. 𝘾𝙧𝙖 is married to an Indo-Canadian woman called Parveen, who is a nurse in pediatric oncology. And the story is set roughly 20 years from now. And there's a reference to statistics in the story which are actually accurate. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the story and then a couple of scenes a little further into the piece. There they were, ahead of him, 4 immense black figures curling downward at the tops, reaching out spindly, crackling fingers toward him. He automatically tugged at his hose pack, but it was hopeless. "Get out," someone yelled, racing past him. "Get out now!" It couldn't be Ray, could it? Not Ray of all people. The nearest black figure was toppling in slow motion. If he didn't move now, he'd be trapped. He woke shouting, as always, strangling in blankets. After he'd wiped the sweat off his face, he stood in the cool band of moonlight, blinds raised, staring out at an ordinary edge of city suburb. Out there in the hills and mountains, the black figures walked ever closer. It was safe for now. Safe for as long as he and his kind did what they were trained to do, hold back the wall of flame from the world. Over black coffee and scrambled eggs, he checked his phone. No call-outs yet, just a kind of ominous silence. End of season anyway, or what used to be the end of season, though it wasn't, not anymore. November, and still over 100 active fires in the coastal region alone. Already there'd been snow at lower levels, melted now, but that didn't mean he was done for the year. He paced, drinking a second cup. Stella bumped her nose into the back of his knee, triggering a bolt of pain. Walking her was usually Parveen's job, but she was on the other side of the planet for a wedding, some cousin or other in Chandigarh. He couldn't keep track. It was beginning to drizzle. Typical November weather for Burnaby, if you could call anything typical nowadays. He hunched into his anorak, the much too expensive one Parveen had bought him last Christmas, and opened the door for Stella to go arrowing out. She'd been his own present to Parveen 2 Christmases ago, a wriggling lump of yellow fur from a farm in Abbotsford. Black lab and golden retriever, the ad said. No, not Christmas, Diwali, when Parveen filled the house with candles and sweets and spent 3 days preparing a feast for their closest friends. Yes, Diwali, of course, the festival of light. That was why they'd named the puppy Stella. A puppy for Diwali, Parveen's brother had said in mock horror. You are worshipping dogs now? Now, Danu. Parveen frowned at him. Don't tease. I wanted one, you know. Ty bought me the perfect gift. To her husband, she had to explain that in parts of India, people offered garlands and food to dogs and marked tikas on their foreheads during the festival. Remember, sweetie, what I told you about dogs in Hinduism? They guard the doors of heaven and hell. No, he hadn't. All those dizzying gods and goddesses with their multiple incarnations and avatars, their pulsating colors, how could anyone recall them all? My mother always said, if your pet dog sneezes while you are going out, it's a good omen, Parveen's sister-in-law added. Remember, Danu, that pug of hers, how she dressed it up like a baby? Then there was an awkward silence, because Parveen's own mother kept asking why there was no baby yet, after 8 years, when Danu and his wife had 3, all boys. They had agreed, he and Parveen, there would never be a baby. How could you bring a baby into a world on fire? The call-out came on Monday. Parveen wouldn't be back for another 2 weeks. He drove Stella to his niece's, where her 18-month-year-old and the dog could tangle together on the floor, and check the coordinates on the status website as he headed to the airport. Estimated size, 5,000 hectares. Suspected cause, person. Stage of control, active. Approximate location, Binder Creek. It had broken out on the weekend, likely a campfire, and blown up fast. An interface fire where cabins, houses, communication lines could all be threatened. He'd fought another fire back in the summer in the same valley, only 10 kilometers from this one. An evacuation order was in place, though so far it affected only 2 pumice mines and a hydroelectric project. Ed Stefanovich would be taking him up. Steady Eddie. He knew all the pilots. He'd been flying in these mountains for longer than he wanted to remember. You got one of the Vulcan crews this time, eh? Ed said as they walked across the tarmac. Skookum bunch of kids. Dave took him up last week. They told Ty that when they called him out. All the wildfire service crews were on other jobs. Since his back injury the year before, when he'd been off for 4 long months, he'd become an itinerant crew boss, flown in on relief or wherever they needed to cobble a crew together. Vulcan had a great rep. He'd heard only good things. For pity's sake, Parveen said after he'd sprained his back. Last year your shoulder, this year your lumbar. You've been doing this half your life, sweetie. You're getting too old. But 37 wasn't old. Some of the men he worked with were in their 40s, even 50s. Now they were calling out the retired veterans as well. The contract crews, like Vulcans, were younger, mostly college kids, though fighting fires year-round meant there was more of a mix. Every year was worse than the year before. He'd still been in college back in 2017 when the province had the worst season in its history, 1,064 fires scorching over 1 million hectares of forest. That 20-year-old record had long receded, along with his plans to teach anthropology. Firefighting paid better and meant steady work. The plane was falling through the drifting smoke, the river twisting up to meet them. As silver gray as the cutthroat trout he'd fished for here on a field trip during his student days, when he'd worked on a pithouse dig near a river tributary. They'd found a seasonal camp dating back 5,500 years. What would they think, those long ago people, of the airborne machine that dropped humans from the sky into flame? He'd met a First Nations firekeeper on that student field trip, an elder who sat silent while her son talked. Their family had been firekeepers for thousands of years, the son told the dig team. Lines of our people walked the land beating drums. We warned the birds and the four-leggeds. That was their hereditary role, to renew and purify the land through fire. My mother taught us that every fire is like a snowflake. No two are alike. Every fire is like a snowflake. Yes, each fire was a live thing with a mind of its own. Fire was a divine attribute, of course, a gift of the gods, or else it was stolen from them and the thief punished. It wasn't something you messed around with. But they thought themselves able to control it. White people had. They'd suppressed it for hundreds of years, and now it rose up against them, blisteringly intense, full of fury. On the second day, he found himself in a subcrew with Reed at the perimeter, digging a firebreak. The weather had changed, bringing rain squalls and sleet. They could focus on tactical work, get ahead of it, though his hands had numbed with cold. Every time he turned and looked at Reed, he saw Graham, that same sunburst of freckles over his nose. If it wasn't for the flickering pain in his lower back, he'd have felt years younger. Don't do this forever, he told Reed as he straightened against a muscle spasm. Don't trash your body like I did. Oh, I'm a goner, Reed said. Anyway, you and Dad did. Yeah, and now your dad's wearing a truss and his rotator cuff shot. The muscle seized again, but he was already over the limit for ibuprofen. How's he doing these days, anyway? He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Graham, now in a desk job at headquarters in Parksville. Bored, Reed said, and laughed, and whacked at the ground with his Pulaski. Tells me how he envies me. Well, the old always did, didn't they? Envy the young. If Ty had married early, like Graham, maybe he'd have chosen parenthood after all, have a son like Reed. Another would-be lifer, in love with gut-wrenching challenge, in love with fire, really, and the outdoors, and the trees themselves. They weren't always menacing and spindly fingered, the trees in his dreams. In the last year or two, things had changed. He had no idea why. That first time, he was in a northern forest with his hand on the white bark of a paper birch. 3 eye-like knots stared back at him. The tree was trying to tell him something, and he stood there listening. The voice was brisk, eager, impatient. He was on the edge of understanding, but he couldn't quite make it out. He woke into sheets damp with sweat, but from exertion, not fear. He lay still, puzzling, for a long time. Spruce came some months later, slow of speech and rather condescending. A black spruce from those same northern forests where so much had burned in the last decade. This tree was young, not much more than a sapling, and the new growth of fireweed frothed around it. Every sound was intense, a downy woodpecker rapping on a nearby trunk, a ground squirrel chittering alarm. The spruce took its time, leaning toward him as if blown by high wind. Ty wondered if it was because he hadn't been able to keep up with the birch. The woodpecker's rapping was a message too, but he was too slow, too stupid. He looked down at his trenching tool and threw it away, and then he woke. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Patricia. That was such a good story. And I love the way the readings went together, you know, the melting ice and icebergs in my selection, and the fire, the heightening fire in yours. So I think, you know, to guide our conversation, we gave ourselves a few conversation points. And the first one that we were interested in talking about was climate change is a zone of intergenerational conflict. Your story dramatizes the whole question of having a child. My novel dramatizes the the difficulties between generations, the conflict between parents and children as they respond to the climate crisis, the everything crisis. So I could talk a little bit about that and then turn it over to you. Does that sound like a good plan? Well, or do you want to go first?
Something popped into my head as you were talking, that your novel actually dramatizes the consequences of having a child. That it's precisely because Alan has Miranda to care for. I mean, he over and over says, "Everything I do is in care of thee." So his whole being is charged with fear about the future and what she is facing. And of course, that leads to the flight to the island. So that's an interesting, you know, Alan and Ty in my story have made these different choices. In fact, something else happens in my story later, which I won't give away. But yes, the whole issue of parenthood, not parenthood, how charged now, how difficult it is, I think, for many of, you know, the younger generation.
And I'm just, you know, I'm curious then why it drew you as something to dramatize in fiction. Like, what was, if we're thinking about that problem of being a parent now, why did you want to fictionalize that dilemma?
I'm not sure it was there when the story started. It was something that occurred as the story evolved, as so often happens for me. I knew Ty came along first, and then gradually I realized who he was married to. And it seemed to grow fairly naturally out of Ty's character, that it was just because he's at the interface right at the front with fire. You know, one couldn't get a more dramatic image of the climate crisis, I think, with this year-round fire season in BC, which is almost the case now in California, actually, not quite yet in BC. It simply seemed to be something that confronted Ty so clearly, and that he and Parveen, who works with children, she works in pediatric oncology, so she's faced with she's caring for children in pain in her work life, and so there was this feeling that both of them were shrinking from that choice, though it's whatever way you make it, it seems to me such a so fraught now, so painful, so difficult, even at the same time as, there's this longing, right? This longing, I think, to create family, to sustain family, to pass on, to teach what you know, and to hope that the world, you can pass on these things you knew and loved, which is you can't take for granted anymore, as is the case in your novel.
Yeah, and it's something that, Allen says directly, Milan Allen. I mean, he changes his name when he comes to the island. He says to Miranda at some point, I wish I could pass on to you, the world, the air of 50 years ago when I was young. And that's a very, acute and urgent desire on his part. And it's interesting because he begins, in the past of the novel, sort of in the same place as your character. I mean, he doesn't really want to have a child, and he gets convinced to do so by his wife's desire. And then he's thrown into this love that's not like no other, and also its intense protectiveness. And that was, one of the creative keys. I mean, the novel uses Shakespeare's play The Tempest as a template, but that line of Prospero's of everything I do for thee, I'm probably misquoting it, became sort of my key for Milan Allen's characters. And it takes him in some fairly extreme directions. I mean, he both protects her physically and won't let her leave the island, but he also engages in this experiment, which is both a thought experiment, and it's an experiment of various, a conceptual experiment on various levels, as readers will discover what he's actually up to as they read the novel. But he is contemplating what it would mean to shoot particulate matter into the atmosphere in order to create a haze and lower global temperatures, a large scale tech hack. And I was interested in a scientist who, who's doing that for very sympathetic reasons, out of, anger and despair and deep, deep worry, which was like some of the climate scientists whom I encountered. And I was just so interested in what it would be like to parent as a climate scientist who holds all that knowledge, and not just all that knowledge, but all that emotion, which gets leached out of the science, but, can be put into a novel and is there in life. And also the experience of being a child of a father like that, and Miranda's journey is to discover her own agency and also a sense of community. She's looking to build a new kind of community. But I was very, I wanted to put particular emphasis on children and fathers in my novel, because fathers are very much part of a larger system of social and economic control. And there's Miranda and her father, and the young stranger, Frank, and his father, Roy, this huge venture capitalist. And Roy would rather like his son to be part of a business as usual plot, but Frank is rebellious and an activist and will have none of that. So I wanted to examine all those charged emotions. I don't know if you have further thoughts on the intergenerational intersections when you think about writing the climate crisis.
I know that there's, the childbearing generation. I know there's a movement, in fact, a birth-free movement among young women. And I don't know how much it's caught on in Canada, but I've certainly encountered it in Europe. Young people deciding not to have children, or I guess women primarily deciding not to have children. Will their minds change? I don't know, but it's a very live, not discussion, live, a really profound decision to make.
And in a sense,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, with Miranda, I mean, she's young enough, and she's 19. But I mean, I did refrain from giving her sort of motherhood
Mhm.
fantasies. Her fantasies have to do with building community and taking action and agency. But I stopped. I mean, but it was something I wondered about. Is this something she's going to dream about? And I think she herself is holding back from imagining that possibility.
Well, in fact, Miranda is she's like most of us. And it's clear in the section that you read that she is unable to imagine the future as any different from the immediate past on the island. She's like her father. In fact, she's trying to hang on to create stasis, as it were. That this will continue forever. This almost fantasy life in a way that they have. This very protected, and of course it isn't at the end protected because there isn't anywhere that's protected. And I was very struck by the images of the icebergs looming around them in that section that you read. In fact, that whole reading, that part of the reading, it felt like viewing a Japanese painting where the humans are very tiny, right? And the landscape is far more significant. And I think that's something that I'm noticing coming into climate, let's call it climate inflected fiction, where all of a sudden other beings have center stage to the extent I suppose that as humans we can do that. We can't actually turn over completely our computers and typewriters to other beings, but we can certainly channel them. And the land is such a presence, the land and its beings in your novel.
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to note that in your story too, I was very aware of the trees as presences, and in their dreamlike almost personification, but they're not made anthropomorphic. They're there as tree presences, and so that world feels very alive, and an indigenous history in place is really acknowledged. And yeah, I mean, I'll talk a little bit more, but I'd love us both to talk about how we come to writing the land from our own specific perspectives. And I'm so glad that you responded to the passage that I read, by feeling that the hugeness of the land and the shrinking of the human, because that was certainly something I was trying to do in the novel, was readjust that relationship. I mean, so much of the history of the novel, there have been nature has been a presence in the Anglo-European novel, but its tradition is still to center the human story, and the individual human story, even in relation to the natural world. And certainly there are older traditions in which the natural world is much more alive, much more of a presence. But in this very realistic and contemporary world that I'm writing, I wanted to enact that readjustment, and make the other elements feel much more like presences. But I also, I mean, I'm writing from the perspective of a newcomer, the child of immigrants in North America. So my family doesn't have a history in this place. And in this novel, I'm writing a fictionalized Fogo Island, which is somewhere I don't have a long personal history on, that I visited over a period of 8 years and talked to people and tried to listen to the land itself. But I also tried in the novel to acknowledge my own newcomerness, and my characters, my central characters, Miranda and her father, are themselves new arrivals, even though the 𝘾𝙧𝙧 is not. But to acknowledge that newness, at the same time as I am gesturing to longer histories in the place, both the settler histories on a small island off the coast of Newfoundland, and older, largely extinguished indigenous histories, and then even longer, geological histories. So that real sense of deep time that moves us beyond the human. And I just, I hope you can feel that a bit in the iceberg section. But I'm curious, for you, Patricia, like how you approach writing this land from your specific perspective?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a real live question for those of us who are settlers. And in my case, I myself am an immigrant. I was born in the UK and immigrated with my family when I was 9, and was thrust straight into the northern bush in northern British Columbia, where my poor mother had to learn to cook on a wood stove, and bears came to the back door, and skunks, and we went blueberry picking, and it was an astonishing world, I think, for a small English child to be thrust into. And it's interesting how I was 3 years ago or so confronted very directly with this whole issue of land and where I stood and what my relationship was, because I ended up in a direct action here in Winnipeg when 60 acres of pristine wetland were threatened with development by a developer who had obtained the land under very shady circumstances that involved the previous city government. And I won't go into that long and sorry history, but the a Métis woman and some other women who had regularly walked this wetland area with their dogs decided to stand up to the bulldozers that arrived one morning and eventually set up a camp. We had immense support from all kinds of people, Indigenous people, Métis people, union members. And I wasn't there at the beginning, but I lived not 10 minutes away. So I walked down one morning with my dog and found myself pulled into this action. And I actually ended up writing an essay to try and explore what this had meant to me, who I was, what right I had to stand here when I had no ground of my own in which to stand, not in this continent. My roots are non-existent here. And in fact, I remember when I lived in the Yukon and I did freelance writing and editing work for the Yukon Native Language Center, and I went to interview a Northern 𝘃𝙀𝙀 elder one day, and she said to me, "Who are your people?" And which was what certainly they would have asked other Indigenous people, because you then recounted who your forebears were and your clan and where you came from and so on. And I remember thinking, why is she asking me? What do I say? It was such to me an unusual question to be asked of a settler, and I answered as best I could. I told her where I was born and so on. But it really made me think about, who are my connections? Who are my ancestors? Can I create not exactly ancestry, but a sense of belonging to this land? And you have a wonderful line in your novel, which I will not be able to quote exactly, but a question about, can we open up to the land we find ourselves on and let it shape us, which I think is a wonderful idea. And in the end, I'm not sure that those of us who are settlers can do much else. And I think it's happening. I think I see that in settlers in Manitoba, people who've worked the land. There's an intense identification with the land, which may be different from Indigenous identification. But I think the whole issue of our relationship with the land and developing a kinship with the land is central to any attempts to face and take on the climate crisis.
Yes, I agree absolutely with what you're saying, and I felt very conscious in the novel of when Allen is talking to Miranda about that on the island. They're still very new arrivals, but I was very conscious of that positioning, that they are immigrants, they are new, and yet this is where they find themselves. This is where I find myself, and this is where you are, and we have to navigate a relationship from here and acknowledge the horrific history and the theft that has gone before, but also accept the labor and the the care of being here going forward.
Yes.
And it's interesting because I'm trying to write an essay at the moment about wild invasives, the plants, but also thinking of myself, as a kind of wild invasive. So we'll see where that goes. And here's Megan, who is going to see if there are questions from the audience. Thanks, Megan.
Yes, I hate to jump in and interrupt an amazing discussion, but we are getting short on time, and we have had some questions that I wanted to make sure we could address. So our first one is directed at you, Catherine, and it's from Brian Bartlett, and they say, Catherine, Shakespeare's The Tempest has often inspired other works, like ones 𝘃𝙧𝙬, 𝘂𝙀, and 𝙃𝙤𝙪𝙧. Were you attempted to read or reread any of such works before or while writing your novel?
Great. Hi, Brian, and thanks for that good question. And yes, I did. I mean, I was thinking about the whole project of adapting Shakespeare, and so not just Tempest adaptations, though there's a whole history of them. And I kind of like entering a space where, it's not about originality. It's about entering a conversation, a long conversation that, Aimé Césaire has written a post-colonial play and, reimagined the character of Caliban and centered his story. Marina Warner has done a very different novelistic adaptation of The Tempest. So I did read some, but I also, I also don't feel that readers need to know that The Tempest to approach Blay's Island, and that was very important to me too, that the novel stand on its own, and that you could enter it without the play, and that the world was alive in ways that were independent of its Shakespearean origins. So thanks for that question.
Lovely. For our next question, we're going to jump over to you, Patricia. We've had a question from Orlin that says, they thought that it was in your interview on CTV Winnipeg that you said everyone seemed to have their own interpretations of Hour of the Crab, and they're wondering, what is your favorite theory that you've heard so far?
Well, when it really struck me, the difference in interpretations is, I was talking to my sister, and I think she began talking about the title story, and she began talking about stars and astrology, and I realized she was thinking of the crab, Cancer, which had not been in my mind whatsoever. It's in fact, the title comes from a very specific tiny gesture in the title story, which readers who read will see. But it also showed me, I think good work, good writing is larger than the author. You're drawing on more than just yourself. Maybe Jung's collective unconscious or whatever, or the divine, or your muse, or whoever. And so I think other levels enter in, and readers bring themselves to the work as well. Of course, their experiences become part of the reading, and so I think if the evidence is there, if the story supports the evidence, then what readers bring to it is a valid interpretation of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've experienced that with the epilogue in Blay's Island, and people bring very different readings to it. And I actually love, especially with endings, that an ending become kind of a co-creation with the reader as you head onwards beyond the book.
That's a great term, co-creation. I totally believe in that, and I want to write in a way that allows the reader to participate as well. I'm not telling the reader everything. The reader is also building this or rebuilding this world as they read. Yeah.
Wonderful. Our next question comes from Mike, and I think we'll let Catherine, if you want to take a first stab at it, you can, or if one of you feels inclined, they can jump on it, but I think both of you can take a stab at it. Mike says, regarding climate change as a backdrop or thread that runs through your story, what was your approach to both including the impact of climate change, but not writing a story of climate change?
That's interesting. I mean, I feel in Blaze Island, the climate, the way in which I'm addressing the climate crisis is quite direct. And I wouldn't, I mean, I did it in this novel. There's a climate scientist at the center, and that was one of my challenges, was to create a rounded, human, complex, embodied climate scientist. I like scientists in fiction. I like science in fiction. I like the intersection of those languages and what arises from that. But I would certainly, not say that all fiction that touches on the climate crisis has to be so direct. There are so many different ways, metaphoric, imagistic, that you can approach it. Looking at the past through the lens of the climate crisis. I mean, I didn't want to write a futuristic dystopia either. That was something I very much didn't want to do. I wanted to think about how you might write a contemporary realism that didn't deny the climate crisis. That was very important to me, that it be present in the unpredictable weather. I mean, there's a big storm, I know that, and there's some exaggerated gestures in the novel, but I really wanted to think about how we experience change and disruption, as we've seen happen during the pandemic. Where we can't look to the past, as Patricia was saying, in order to imagine the future. What does that feel like? And there's all sorts of fictional possibilities for that feeling. And that, I think, was very much at the heart of my project. Patricia, over to you.
Well, the story I chose to read from is I suppose, like Catherine's novel, with someone directly confronting the consequences of the climate crisis. Other stories in the book are less direct, and in fact the title story and the sequel, the suite of stories, 4 stories that are entitled "The Hour of the Crab," really brings a young, fairly naive Canadian vacationer into one of the major human consequences of the climate crisis, which is undocumented migration out of Africa into Europe. And the young woman at the center of the story finds a corpse of a migrant on a beach where she's gone to have a holiday, and is faced with the consequences of what to do with that. And I think for me, there was a very strong sense of we who are privileged and who are less directly affected, at least at this point, and will always be less affected by those who are marginalized. I wanted to see what happened when someone from that background was confronted by the human consequences. What was she going to do with that? How was she going to act? I guess I've been haunted by photographs of, and I can think of one in particular, of migrants arriving on a beach in Spain, and not 100 meters away are people sunbathing. And do they get up and assist? No. Although, of course, there are other people who've gone to volunteer in these situations. The Canadian writer Stephen Houghton being one of them. And I remember thinking, what would I do? Would I continue sunbathing, or would I get up and help? And until you're actually placed in that position, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I think what Patricia's saying is so important, that it seems to me, writing the climate crisis isn't just about, weird weather, but it's building in fictional worlds all these complex webs of interconnection between different parts of the world, different forms of climate justice and injustice, which are the results of capitalism and various kinds of social injustice. And your story, your suite of stories, does that so beautifully and so richly. There's really that experience of complexity. And that feels so essential to the task of responding to, the everything crisis.
Yes. Yeah. What do we do when we're directly faced with it?
Yeah.
Do we still turn away?
Yeah, and all the various ways that we might inhabit, denialism,
yes,
or turn away.
absolutely, yeah.
All right, we're gonna squeeze in one more question before we have to let everyone go. And it's another question from Mike, but I think it's quite interesting. He says, what question would you like to be asked about your books, but is often never asked?
I suspect Mike is a writer himself.
What do you think, Patricia? Did I learn to go fishing? I don't know. How much skiddooing did I do on 𝘾𝙁 Island? Have I swum out to an iceberg? The answer is no, but I have,
Oh, you've been asked that. Yes.
No, I haven't been asked. What question would I want to be asked? Have I ever seen a polar bear? I mean, not in the wild. No, I haven't. Though they have come to 𝘾𝙁 Island.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. What question would you want to be asked? I'm trying to think
what question I would want to be asked. I guess what I want readers to respond to is the creation of imaginative worlds, that it doesn't necessarily follow that writers have to have done those things or participated in them. Emotionally, yes, obviously there has to be an emotional connection to your characters, but that's one of the wonderful things about fiction. You get to live all these multiple lives. I will never be a wildland firefighter in real life, nor do I really want to be, but I was during that story. I got to be Ty. I got to face Ty's dilemmas and challenges, and I think that's that's such a joy. It's such a joy and a privilege to be able to do that.
I would just say slightly more on a serious note that one of the things I don't often get asked about is just that, the characters in this novel they're not all white. Many have different racial backgrounds. Caleb himself has he's biracial and has a mysterious father who's probably from the Caribbean. But I don't often get asked about the way in which my characters are racialized. And that, sort of interests me in a more serious way. It is something I would say that racialized reviewers have pick up or note more than white reviewers. So yeah, that's slightly more serious response, but thank you for that question.
And with that, that's going to be all the time that we have for tonight. I wish we had all of the night, but unfortunately we do not. So I would like to say another extra special thank you to everyone who tuned in and to all of the questions. And as a reminder for anyone who is waiting to get their fabulous copy of the books that were discussed and read from today, you can go to kingsbookstore.ca and you can order a copy there. And if you're close by, maybe they can drop it off on their bicycle.
And readers will really have to use their imaginations to pretend that Catherine and I, have signed the books, which we can't do virtually.
But if anyone wants a signed copy, email me, and I'm happy to send you a book plate. Actually, that I can do, from a distance. So
what a clever idea. Yes.
Yeah. Patricia, let me just say again, what a pleasure it's been conversing you with this evening. I feel like we could go on, and I wish we were sitting in a bar and could, just go on and on. And Megan, thank you for, being such a fabulous host this evening. And
I'm going to take a rain check on that bar get together after all. After the pandemic is over, we can at least do a little bit more traveling. It was wonderful, Catherine, once again, and thank you also, Megan, for being so gracious against your beautiful image of what really looks like it could be BC forest with all that undergrowth. Yes.
Yeah, so thank you everyone, and have a lovely, lovely night. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.